We continue now at the top of Daf Zayin Amud Beis Meseches Makkos. This is Makkos Daf 17b. On the previous Amud, the Gemara brought a brisa which darshan the pasuk of Lo Sucha Lechol B'Sharecha, darshaning the pasuk out of order and saying that each part of the pasuk refers to a different kind of kodesh. It could be Meiser Sheni, Bikurim, Bechor, Kachim Kalim, Kachei Kachim, and a different level of prohibition. That's what Rabbi Shimon said. Each one has its own level of prohibition. That's what the pasuk is actually referring to. And now at the end of the brisa, darshaning the word Nidarecha, which refers to Karbonola, the brisa concludes, Rabbi Shimon concludes, that's referring Ela lo ochel min ha'ola la'achar zrika. It's talking about eating from the karbonola after the sprinkling of the blood. Afilu bifnim, even when you're within the kloim, even within the curtains, shehu loka, the person is going to get malchus, because the karbonola, of course, all goes on the mizbeach. It is not eaten by people. Rashi explains, lo ochel ola afilu la'achar zrika, again, eating the karbonola even after the sprinkling of the blood. Va'afilu kohen, even if he's a kohen, shehu loka, he's going to get malchus. V'azharas asay eshkechan babi alman, we find in Ashara a positive commandment, but this would add a negative commandment. And the Gemara continues, Amar Rava says, Dialida ime, somebody who his mother gives birth to him, Rabbi Shimon Tailed, it should be a child like Rabbi Shimon, V'lo lo Tailed, and if not, don't bother giving birth. Rashi explains, Dialida ime Rabbi Shimon Tailed, Kol she'imo yoledes, anybody whose mother is giving birth to Vakesh Rachamim Yehi Ratzon Sheyehei Rabbi Shimon, she should daven for mercy, Yehi Ratzon, it should be his will that this person should be like Rabbi Shimon. The point over here is Rava was saying that this drasha of Rabbi Shimon is a great drasha. Rabbi Shimon is a great individual. And Rava continues, V'afagav the islu pircha. Now, even though we can refute Rabbi Shimon, because Rabbi Shimon was always relying on the fact that one thing is stricter than the other, and we'll see in a moment why maybe one thing is not necessarily stricter than the other, even though we have that refutation, but still, Rabbi Shimon's drasha is great. And the Gemara continues and explains what the refutation is. My chumra de bikurim meiser. For example, why is it that we say that Rabbi Shimon assumes that bikurim is stricter than meiser sheni? Shekein asurim lazarim, because bikurim is something that is forbidden to non-kohanim. But adarabba, but you could say the opposite. Meiser chamer could be meiser sheni is stricter. Shekein asur laonin, because that's asur for a person who's an onen. An onen is a person who's in acute mourning. That's the day that the relative died before the burial. So again, you see that in a certain way, meiser sheni could be stricter. Umay chumra de todu shlamim meiser. And in what way is carbon tod and carbon shlamim stricter than meiser? Shekein te'unin matan damim ve'emur and l'gavim mizbeach, because that goes some of it on the mizbeach, the blood and the innards, they go to the mizbeach. But adarabba, you could say the opposite. Meiser chamer could be meiser sheni is stricter. Shekein te'unin kesef tzur, because there's a requirement there when you're redeeming the meiser sheni, you use minted coins. Umay chumra de bechor mitodu shlamim, and what's the strictness of bechor over tod and shlamim? Shekein kedusha asomei rechem, because firstborn animal is holy from the womb. Adrabba, you could say the opposite. Todu shlamim chamurim, it could be that tod and shlamim are stricter. Shekein te'unim smicha unesachim utnufas chazav v'shok, because they require smicha. You lean on it, you have libations with it. You also have the waving of the breast and the thigh. Umay chumra de chatos v'yasham bechor, and in what way is carbon chatos and asham stricter than bechor? Shekein kachei kachim, because those are the kind of karbonos that are considered kachei kachim. They're holy of holies. That's the holier kinds of karbonos. That's chatos and asham. But adarab, on the contrary, bechor chamer, one could argue that bechor is stricter. Shekein kedusha asomei rechem, because its holiness is from the womb. Umay chumra de olam echatas v'yasham, and in what way is carbon ola stricter than chatas and asham? Shekein kolol, because it's entirely burned on the mizbeach. Adarab, on the contrary, chatas v'yasham chamiri, one can argue that chatas and asham are stricter. Shekein mechapri, because those are atonements. V'kulu chamiri me'ola, and one can argue that all of them are stricter than an ola. Disbu shtei achilos, because they're consumed in two ways, meaning a carbon ola is only put on the mizbeach, whereas other karbonos, it's eaten by people and it's on the mizbeach. And so therefore you do have a technical refutation for every single stringency that Rabbi Shimon mentioned. And so the Gemara continues, Elamai dialida ime ke Rabbi Shimon. Well, if that's the case, why should it be that all mothers should daven that their children should be like Rabbi Shimon, if we can refute every single part of what Rabbi Shimon said? And the Gemara answers to that, Elamai desvira leila didei, because according to what he held in terms of the level of strictness, Mesaris leila kra v'darish le, what was brilliant was he rearranged the pasuk in order to darshan it. But the Gemara continues and asks, but can we issue warnings based on Kal V'chomers? The entire premise of Rabbi Shimon is that based based on these Kal V'chomers, we already know some of the prohibitions, and so therefore he applies other prohibitions in terms of what the pasuk is talking about. But that would mean that the pasuk is warning based on a Kal V'chomer. Even according to the one who says we can punish based on a Kal V'chomer, Ein Mazhirin Minadin, we're not allowed to warn based on a Kal V'chomer. And the Gemara says to that, Isur B'alma. Actually, Rabbi Shimon didn't mean that it's a real warning. He just meant it's an Isur. Rashi explains Isur B'alma, it's just a mere prohibition. Haidaka Maisi B'kulu Azhara, when he's bringing all of these warnings B'Kal V'chomer with a Kal V'chomer, L'Isur B'alma Kamer, it's just for a mere prohibition. V'lo Malkus, he was never saying that you're going to get Malkus. But the Gemara continues, is that really true? V'yomer Rava, but Rava said, Zar she'achal min ha'ola lifnei zrika chutz l'choma, that a zar, a non-kohen, if he eats from a carbon ola before the sprinkling of the blood, outside of the walls, Rabbi Shimon Loka, according to Rabbi Shimon Loka Chamish, the person would actually get 5 sets of malchus. So apparently we are learning malchus in all of these situations. And the Gemara says, no, that's not what it meant. Chamisha Isur and Habit simply meant that there were 5 prohibitions. It doesn't actually mean Loka Chamish, that there are 5 sets of malchus. But the Gemara still continues and asks, V'anon tanan, Elohein alokin, but we learned in our Mishnah the following get malchus. And Rashi explains, Zar sha'achal min ha'ola, a non-Kohen that eats from carbon ola, dafka zar ka'amar. Rashi notes that we're talking specifically about a non-Kohen. V'afagav de Kohen lagave ola zarhu. Now, even though a Kohen, with regards to a carbon ola, is considered a zar, because no one's allowed to eat a carbon ola, hacha zar dafka ka'amar. Here we're only talking about a non-Kohen. De Kohen, because if we're talking about a Kohen, batzer lachad lav, you're actually going to be missing one of the lavin. You need to have 5 total here. To hachamish de ka'amar, because the 5 are as follows. Chad misham chutz lechoma. One is because it's outside of the walls of Yerushalayim, Dasi B'Kal V'chomer Mimaiser. That again, the Brisa and the previous Amud learned from Meiser Sheni using Kal V'chomer. V'chad Mishum Lefnei Zrika, Dasi B'Kal V'chomer Toda Shlamim. One is because of eating it before the sprinkling of the blood. That was a Kal V'chomer from Toda and Shlamim. V'chad Mishum Zar Gomer. One is because he's a Zar Afilo La'achar Zrika. That's even after sprinkling. Dasi B'Kal V'chomer Mi B'chor. That's learned from a Kal V'chomer from B'chor. V'Kol Shekain Lefnei Zrika, and certainly before Zrika. V'chad Mishum Ochel Chutz L'Kloim. One is because of eating outside the curtains. Dasi B'Kal V'chomer Mechatos V'Yosham. That's a Kal V'chomer from Chatos and Osham. V'chan misham ochel ola v'afilu kohen. One is just because eating a carbon ola, even if he was a kohen, that's a problem. U'v'socha kloim, even if it's within the curtains. V'chol shekein zar chutz l'kloim v'chutz l'choma. Certainly, if it's a non-kohen outside the kloim, outside the curtains and outside the wall. In any case, alma loka chamish, we see that there's 5 sets of malchus. Misham chamisha isurim. The Gemara then said it's because of 5 prohibitions. Ka'amar, that's all he was saying. V'lo lilkos alein. He wasn't saying that there's malchus for all of them. But the Gemara then continued to ask, V'anon tanan elohein alokin. But the Mishnah said they get malchus. The katani bikurim va'ochel katshe kachim chutz l'kloim. And in the Mishnah is the case of bikurim and eating katshe kachim chutz l'kloim. And so we see that the person does get malchus. And we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Yud Ches Amud Aleph.